Hi. Now here we are again. Now we're going to be looking at continuing the story of Joseph. We're moving on to part 5. For those who have listened to the series, you'll know that the last time Joseph was released from prison in order to interpret some dream that Pharaoh had had. And he successfully interpreted that dream. Now, I want to continue from there. What happens next in the life of Joseph? So, as before, I'm going to try and tell the story from the perspective of Joseph. I'm going to try and put myself into his situation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I have in preparing for this story. Here we go. Now, I was now 30 years old. And as you'll remember, when I was initially sold by my brothers, I was 17. So, for 13 years, I have been here in Egypt under more and more difficult circumstances. When I was brought to Egypt by the traders that my brothers had sold me to, I became a slave to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Things went well in that home, as a servant, as a slave, because I never gave up on God. I continued to trust in Him. And then things turned for the worst when Potiphar's wife lied about me, giving me a horrendous reputation for doing a terrible crime that I never committed. Now, this woman had benefited from the blessings that God had brought upon that household through me, but then I ended up in prison. Prison was not a pleasant affair. It was hard. It's not the best of places to be. Cold, dirty, gloomy. But again, I continued to trust in God, and I knew God's presence with me through that. So now here I was, at the age of 30, and I have interpreted this dream for Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is satisfied with the interpretation. And I've advised him in what he needed to do. And he needed to have someone put in charge to prepare for what was coming. For there was coming 7 years of great prosperity, and that would be followed by 7 terrible years of famine. And if something wasn't done to prepare for those 7 years of famine, then the nation of Egypt would be wiped out. And possibly, and probably, many of the nations around about Egypt. So Pharaoh and his officials decided that I was the best man to put in charge. Now, you might think, after 13 horrible years, after all the injustice that had been done to me, why would you choose to help? Why would you choose to remain in this country where you'd experienced so much trouble and grief? Why wouldn't you just go home to your father? After all, I'd missed my father. I had this tremendous loving relationship with my father. I respected and honoured him. And I knew that he would be full of grief because he would believe that I was dead. And so you might think, why don't you just go home? Why don't you just go back to that? Why don't you just leave the Egyptians to go on with their trouble? You've given them the advice that they need. Let them handle it. But I knew that would not be God's will. God doesn't want us to just live easy lives of selfish pleasure. God had shown me, as well as Pharaoh, what was going to happen. That many people could potentially lose their lives. This nation of Egypt could be wiped out, and how many others around about the nation could be wiped out. This famine could even affect my family. And I knew that God cares for people. And I knew that He would expect me to do the same thing. And so I took on the responsibility that Pharaoh offered me. I took on the responsibility of Prime Minister. Now, this was going to be the most difficult task I had ever faced in my life. This was a huge responsibility. The lives of thousands of people were in my hands, effectively. And so that very day I set out. I took on that responsibility. I took on that work. And from that very day, I set out to complete the tasks that were required. Now, there were many tasks required. And I started with going right through the land of Egypt and seeing what the situation was. I would find out where crops could be grown. Where were they currently growing? Was there land where more crops could be grown? Where would the storehouses be required? Where would be the best place to place these storehouses? How was the population of Egypt dispersed? What about people that would need to be required? People that would need to be put in place. People who would be responsible for growing these crops. People who would be responsible for collecting these crops. People who would be responsible for storing these crops safely in the storehouses. People responsible for securing these storehouses. People who would be responsible for bringing the food, for giving the food to those who were in need during those years of famine. And what about the foreigners? Foreigners would come because this famine would affect them as well as Egypt. Foreigners would come seeking food. There was the possibility that some might come to steal the food. Security had to be put in place for that. Others would come to purchase food. How were we going to handle that? What about transport? So many things needed to be put in place. So much preparation was required. And from that very first day, I set out to work. And there was never a day where I wasn't thinking or doing something in preparation for this famine. And I knew the help, I knew the guidance and the wisdom and the guidance of God. For I depended upon God. I knew this was a huge task. And I knew I had to keep trusting in God, that He would guide me and help me to do this job well. Well, the 7 good years came, and they were tremendous years. Egypt and no other land had ever seen crops like the ones we grew during those 7 years. There was great prosperity. The crops were collected. People had more than enough food to live on. And we took all the surplus food that was required and they were put into these storehouses. We recorded the amount of grain that was going in. But eventually, by the time we got to that 7th good year, there was so much grain that we gave up recording it. The storehouses that we had built were filled to capacity with grain. There was going to be more than enough grain to see Egypt through these years. Now, these years were good for me personally. Pharaoh had given me a wife, as well as making me his prime minister. And during those 7 good years, God blessed me with 2 sons. The first was called Manasseh. Now, in our day, the names of our children meant something. And the name of Manasseh was this: God has made me forget all my troubles. I had had 13 years of troubles, and God had made me forget those years of troubles with this blessing. The second son was called Ephraim, and his name meant this: God has made me fruitful in the land of my grief. That's what Egypt had been to me for 13 years. It had been a land of grief. I missed my father. I missed my freedom. But God had made me fruitful in this land. And I praised my God. And I thanked my God for all that he had done, for seeing me through, for bringing me through those years, for the things he taught me through those difficult years, things that were now important and useful today in this service I was doing for Egypt and for my God. And so God blessed me. And God gave me the guidance I needed. But those 7 years, those 7 good years ended, just as God had told us. And the 7 years of famine began. And nothing grew in Egypt. And nothing was growing in the lands around Egypt. And so the distribution of grain was put in place. Now, I had decided to take responsibility for dealing with the foreigners who would come to our land. They could only purchase their grain from the storehouse in our city. And they all had to come before me first of all. And one day, 10 men appeared in my presence. And like everyone else who came before me, they had to bow in my presence. And I recognized these 10 men, for these 10 men were my brothers, the ones who had sold me into slavery. Now, they didn't recognize me. I was dressed completely differently from any way that they had ever seen me before. I had changed over those 13 years. And I spoke to these men through an interpreter. I had learned the language of Egypt. And I spoke to my brothers through an interpreter. You know, I wondered, had my brothers ever changed? Did they ever think about me? Did they regret what they had done to me? Did they regret what they'd done to our father? Or were they still selfish? Were they still dishonest? Were they still corrupt? And so I tested my brothers. I accused them of being spies. And they leapt to their defense, telling me that they were all brothers, telling me that their father was back in the land of Canaan with the youngest of the brothers, and even sharing with me that they'd had another brother who was no longer with them, and that was me. I told them that I didn't believe them. And I told these men that I was putting them in prison. And I put them in prison for 3 days while I thought about the best course of action to take. On the third day I took them out of prison. And I told them that I was going to keep one of them here in Egypt, in prison. The others could go home. I would give them grain. But to prove that they were honest men, they must bring their youngest brother back with them. If they did not do this, the brother that was here in Egypt would remain here in Egypt. And these men agreed. So I chose one of the brothers. It was Simeon. And he stayed here in Egypt. I told my men to fill the sacks of my brothers with food. And these men I also told in secret to put the money that the brothers had brought back into the top of their sacks. Now I overheard my brothers. They didn't know, obviously, that I was Joseph, and they didn't know that I could understand what they were saying. But I overheard my brothers, and they talked about me. They talked about how God was punishing them. They recalled how I had pleaded with them when they were going to sell me. And I had pleaded with them, don't do this to me. Don't think what you're doing to Father. But they ignored everything I had said. They ignored my pleas and they sold me. And I overheard them talking about it. I overheard them say that God was punishing them for what they had done. They now knew and appreciated that what they had done was wrong. Their conscience had bothered them. They had ignored their conscience, and now they're filled with guilt. But that wasn't enough. I needed to know that they were now honest men. So I sent them home with their grain, reminding them that Simeon would not be released until their youngest brother was returned here to Egypt, so that I could see him. Well, off they went, and I learned this later on, that the brothers had travelled and had to camp for the night. And one of the brothers had gone into his sack to get some grain for his donkey. And in going into the sack, he discovered the money that he'd paid for the grain. And he was filled with fear. And he told his brothers about the money being in the sack. And they were all filled with fear. How could they prove that they were honest men if they had taken the money? They didn't know how the money had got into the sack, but they're thinking that man in Egypt, that commander, that prime minister, he's going to think we stole the money. And they're filled with fear. And they continued the following day until they got home, where they told their father everything that had happened. They told their father how they had been questioned, how they had been accused of being spies. They told their father how Simeon had been kept prisoner back in Egypt. They told their father how that man there in Egypt, that prime minister, demanded that we take our brother back to him so that he could see that we were honest men. But then they all discovered that their money was back in their sacks. Every one of them had the money returned. And they were full of fear. What would happen if they were to go back to Egypt? And their father Jacob told them that there was no way they were taking his youngest. He had lost Joseph already. He had lost Simeon. You're not taking him. Even though Reuben pleaded with his father and promised his father that he would ensure his safety. But Jacob refused. And that's the end of this part of the story. In the next part of the story, we'll find out what happens next. But there are some great lessons in this story for us, and I want to share these lessons with us. I want to think first of all about God's plan. You know, God had given Joseph that dream, which we learned about in the first part of the story. You know, his brothers and him, they'd been out cutting the grain, and they tied the grain into big bushels, and Joseph had dreamed about how his brothers' bushels had all bowed down before his bushel. Now the brothers knew what this meant. They knew that Joseph was claiming that one day they would bow down before him, and they hated him. They thought he was being pompous and prideful. But he was telling them the dream that God had given him. And here in Egypt, that's exactly what the brothers had to do. As they came before Joseph, they bowed low before him. You see, God's plans are always successful. God's plans always come true. Now, they may not work out the way we think they should work out. And when you look at the life that Joseph has gone through, would you have said that was how it should happen? And yet that's the way God not only allowed it, but planned it. Joseph would learn things through these experiences, these hard and difficult times. And no matter what obstacles men try to put in their way, God's plans will always succeed. Now, I want to think about choices. I want to think about, first of all, the choice that Joseph made. There was Joseph. He'd suffered for 13 years in Egypt. He'd gone through many troubles. He'd experienced much grief. And now that he has been released from prison and he'd done what Pharaoh asked him, he'd interpreted this dream to Pharaoh's satisfaction. Joseph did not turn down the responsibility that Pharaoh offered him. Joseph did not just go home to his father, much as he missed his father. Joseph did not just look for a life of ease, a life of comfort after these 13 years that were far from comfortable and peaceful. Joseph chose to take on the responsibility, to take on the hard work that was going to be required to save this nation of Egypt and those in the nations around Egypt. What about the choices that the brothers had made? The choice to sell their brother. Can you picture it? Can you picture Joseph just pleading with his brothers as they drag him off to sell him to the tradesmen? You know, I believe that the brothers would have experienced conscience speaking to them, telling them that this act was not right. What they were doing was wrong. God has given us a conscience, telling us when we're doing wrong and giving us the opportunity to stop doing it. But so often we ignore our conscience for whatever reason it may be, whether it be out of anger, jealousy, pride, whatever. So many times we ignore our conscience and we continue with that act. The things that we say, the things that we do that are wrong. Now, it is also true that often when we do ignore our conscience, we then experience guilt. And guilt can remain with us for the rest of our lives, depending upon what we are guilty of. And we see in the story how Joseph's brothers were tormented with guilt. They had done something and they didn't think it could be undone. They knew it was wrong. They knew that God had witnessed what they had done. And we see how they are tormented by that guilt. And they believed that God was punishing them for what they had done. Guilt. Guilt can destroy your life. But there are people who manage to overcome their conscience and overcome their guilt. And often they do it by continuing to do wrong. You do something wrong. You're accused of doing something wrong. You lie to defend yourself. You have to lie again and again, and eventually you may escape punishment. But the more you ignore and overcome your conscience and your guilt, the more you decline morally. And those who follow that path end up doing greater acts of wickedness. Then we move on to consequences. You see, there are consequences for the choices that we make and the things that we say and do. Sometimes the consequences come swiftly. You get caught in the act and there's immediate punishment. You get caught doing a crime, you go to the court, you're found guilty, there's punishment. Sometimes you may think you've got off with the act, but years later, it catches up with you and you face punishment. But a warning to those who think that they've got off scot-free, that there's no way they'll ever be found out. And this is your warning. God witnesses everything you say and do. God even witnesses the motives of our hearts. Why we make the choices we make. And one day we will all face God. The God who knows every wrong thing we have ever said and done and thought. And we will face him as our judge. Our judge. There will be no defense for you. For God has every detail. He remembers everything. He knows more about the thing that you did than you remember. And God will find you guilty. And God will punish you. And God is just. And those who are guilty will not escape his justice. But there is a way. There is a way for us to be free of our guilt. There is a way to escape God's judgment. And God has provided that way. For God knows our weakness. And God knows all about our sin. That thing in us that causes us to do all those wrong things. And God has provided a way to escape his judgment and punishment. And he did it by sending his son Jesus. Jesus came from heaven. He is the eternal Son of God. He was born into this world and lived a perfect, holy life. The only man to ever live on the face of this planet who never sinned even once, not even in his thoughts. He was perfect and holy, and that was a requirement because the task that God had given him to do was to be the sacrifice for sin. Jesus Christ came to save sinners. He came to save you. He came to save me. And that includes every soul in this world. He came to save us from our sin. And he did this by taking your judgment and taking your punishment. He became sin for you. He took your sin upon himself. And God judged him for your sin. And God punished him for your sin and for my sin. And then Jesus died upon that cross. And to show that God was satisfied, that the price had been paid, on the third day Jesus was raised again. He is alive. And he returned to heaven to sit at the right hand of God. And God offers you salvation. He offers you the opportunity to be saved from your sin, to be free of your guilt. And what you must do is confess to him your sin. He knows you're a sinner, but you need to confess it to him, that you know, that you believe you're a sinner, that you have failed him. And you need to desire, you need to have that desire in your heart that you want to turn away from your sin. You don't want to continue with that kind of life. That you want to honour God. And you must believe that Jesus personally died for you. That he paid the price for your sins. And by believing with all your heart, and God knows when it's real, and God knows when it's fake. But if you are real in these things, if you truly believe these things, then God promises that you will be forgiven. He will remember your sins no more. You will never face him as your judge, and you will never experience his punishment. Indeed, you will be greatly blessed. God will give you eternal life. God will make you one of his children. And then it is our responsibility to honour God, to live a moral life, to read our Bible, to speak to God in prayer, to learn what God desires us to do, to live lives of love, caring for others, just like Joseph. Joseph looked upon the lives of those round about him. He didn't know them, but he looked upon the lives of those around him, and he cared for them as much as he cared for himself. And he worked as hard as he could with a loving heart and with wisdom to do what he could to save these people. That's what God looks to us. He doesn't look to you to now go and live a life of pleasure, a life of ease. I'm going to heaven and that's great. He looks to you to choose the right path and to honour and serve God by loving and caring for others. So that's our lessons for today from this tremendous story. And again, I really appreciate you for coming in and for watching and listening to these stories. We'll see you the next time.